Hello, everyone. Oh, look at those numbers jumping. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Amanda Farina. I'm your host for today's session. And in today's session, we have Bryan Littlefair, CEO of Cambridge Cyber Advisors and past global CISO of Vodafone Group and Aviva. And he's going to offer his insight on making third-party risk a priority for your executive team. And as an added bonus, we have Scott Lang, our very own VP of Product Marketing, joining us today as well. And we'd love to know what prompted you guys to be here today. So I'm going to put up a poll here called While You're Waiting. And we're just curious as to what brought you to our session today. Is it for education? Is it project research? You don't know why you're here? You know, that's a whole issue in itself. Love to find out how you got here if you have no idea. Or you're a prevalent customer, which is always great. I mean, we'd love to have you here. So let's go over a couple of housekeeping items. You guys are all muted automatically, but we do want to keep this as interactive as possible. So please use the Q&A, take advantage of Bryan's brains, Scott's brains, ask as many questions as you can, but just to keep the flow going, we'll more than likely do Q&A at the end with another poll question, which also brings me to another thing. Please be honest with your poll answers because we will personally follow up based on what you say. So especially if you're saying something along the lines of yes to something, expect something from me or expect something from my counterpart, Melissa or Landon. So let's not get confused there. The session's being recorded as well, so you'll get it in your inbox either today, end of day, or tomorrow. So you'll have an extra time to review it, share it with friends, whatever it is, but you'll have it in your hands as soon as we possibly can give it to you. So I think that is it for me. I think we're good to go here. Bryan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. And hi, everyone. It's great to be able to talk to you from the UK today. So as you're starting your day or in the middle of your day, it's winding to an end over here. But this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I think, as Amanda said, I've been a Chief Information Security Officer for a fair few organizations and still continue to do that as an interim or roaming executive. But I spend a lot of time in the boardroom and a lot of time speaking at conferences as well on how to bridge the perceived chasm that can be between the CISO and the board or the CISO and the executive team, or to improve that relationship. So it's great to be able to use third-party risk management, a topic that's very close to my heart, on some examples and certainly some techniques, or what are some of the challenges and issues that I actually see on a day-to-day basis. So let's crack on with this. So that's me. I need a haircut. Right, so a little bit of scene setting. So I've spent certainly the last decade sitting in boardrooms, not just for the security section. So when you're a CISO, you're kind of wheeled in, you do your CISO bit, and then you're wheeled out. Now as a cyber advisor or a consultant to boards and executive teams around the world, you get to see a lot more of the board meeting, which has its pros and cons. You also have to read the board pack and those aspects as well. But I've seen a transition over that period in terms of, boards starting to get cybersecurity. And I think, what's driving that is monitoring the global regulations around the world for a lot of multinational clients. And we are starting to see the requirements and, the directives that they set starting to harmonize and be very clear about, certainly if you're in a regulated sector, what their expectations are of how your organization treats cybersecurity. And I think, whether you're in the US side or on the UK and European side, governments, or certainly the citizens within those governments, are starting to think, well, we trust our data with all of these customers, and, there's breach after breach or incident after incident. And, they want to get that trust model fixed and resolved. They want citizens or people living within countries to actually have some trust with that organization that they're giving their data with. So there's a requirement on that organization to put in the appropriate controls and the appropriate measures. But as we all know, it's not just that organization you're liaising with. There's a whole third party, fourth party, nth party supply chain that in a lot of cases actually gets hold of customer data. So that's why boards and executive teams, I think, are starting to really care and, starting to focus down on these topics as well. So I see them actually driving for that clarity, that risk position. And actually, I see a lot of the problem being on our side now, the security team side, saying, we've been trying to tell them this message for so long. Now they're asking for it, but they're not 100% happy with how we're telling that story, or certainly not in all cases. And a lot of organizations are starting from a fairly low maturity point when it comes to third-party risk management. It's a long, complex journey to get your head around what is the risk that is presented to the parent organization from your entire supply chain. So if you're just embarking on that journey, there are obviously some acceleration points that you can put in place, but it's going to take time to get to that viewpoint. And a lot of organizations, as I'll cover in this slide deck, are at a different maturity point, and no one's at the same position. Every organization is different. But I think if you do recognize that the board will be interested in what you've got to say. Board and executive team, I know, are different entities, but for this purposes are interchangeable. They want that clarity, they want that information. And I think if you can get your head around the formats that they want that information presenting in terms of the universal language of the board being finance and risk, then I think you'll start to get that traction. And hopefully what I'm going to talk about today are what are some of the approaches that I've seen work, what are some of the approaches that I've seen that don't work? And then obviously, hopefully I'm going to leave a little bit of time after Scott and myself have talked for some Q&A and challenge. And as I always say on these, please feel free to disagree or challenge, right? These are just my views and my perspectives. And if you've got another one, I'm more than happy to debate that. But I think, what we are seeing across the globe is we're seeing these challenges, we're seeing these issues. We're seeing, hackers being very public, that, it's easier to hack a parent organization via their supply chain with those trusted relationships in place than it is in some cases to go after the parent organization. That parent organization might have 200, 300, 400 security team members. They might have budgets 10, 20, 30 million, or be a lot smaller. But, the organizations they put trusted network, user relationships in, they won't have that capability, or certainly not all of them. So there's a lot of effort in the hacking community, so to say, to identify where are those relationships in place and which suppliers does company X, Y, and Z use, and can they go after them and leverage that pre-existing trust relationship. So let's try and get it right. Let's debate the topic. And I think when you do, you'll be pushing on that open door. And I think that's what the boards want to do. They want that clarity of information, is because they want to engage. A lot of them don't know how to engage in complex security topics. So I think we don't have to simplify it because they're very clever people. We have to recognize their skill set and present it in a language that they can understand. So that's what we're going to hopefully cover today. So why do we actually need third-party insurance? And why do the executive team actually care? So we've already touched on regulations. Regulations are only going to go one way in my view. And I really would, one of my personal desires would be that regulators talked more. For example, if you're running a large global multinational in 60, 70, 80 countries, for example, regulations differ in every country that your organization operates in. And that harmonization, there's a lot of overlaps. That harmonization would certainly make a lot of sense. And, we see that to some degree, but certainly not all. And we'll cover that a little bit later on. We need it for our risk management, right? So we need to understand what role the third parties play in us delivering our product or service to our end customer. And in a lot of cases, they play a significant role. They might be running our IT systems, or if we're a producer of a product, they might be delivering our raw products and that we need, or the raw ingredients that we actually need to make our product to sell. And there's a lot of factors that can impact that. They could be attacked, they might go offline. And then how can we continue obviously selling our services, but equally physical. We need to understand that from a risk management perspective. And a great example is the Suez Canal being blocked. So if container ships can't get through that canal, then obviously our product can't get to the end destination and we can't sell it to the customers. And that can cause brand or reputational damage. It can cause customers to move to the competition. So we're not just talking cyber here, we're talking third-party assurance, and that's a more holistic view in terms of managing that risk. And it's important we recognize that. And we need to get this right so that we can support business decisions as well. So the business needs to, consume the metrics and data that we can actually present to them, to know how fast they can move, how fast they can accelerate, how fast they can expand, and what are the risks that are inherent in them doing that. And I often see a bit of a disconnect here in terms of the security team assessing risk and assessing security really for their own compliance requirements, and not actually being fully integrated with the broader business. And I think a really effective third-party risk management program has, the full support and backing from the business, but equally the data that's captured, analyzed, is disseminated broadly into the organization and really helps support and underpin other business decisions that are required. And I think that's a really good indicator that you're doing the right thing. But obviously compliance really matters as well. Pick an acronym, right? There's going to be thousands around the world, but they all certainly dictate how we manage our third parties. And that's really because it's a huge risk because of the things that we've already discussed. And again, very little, global adherence here. There's 160 different legislations that pertain to how we manage data. So whether you've got the California Act over there in the US, or you've got GDPR over here in Europe, there's 160 of those around the globe. So if you are running a global multinational organization, it's getting your head around what are we actually required to comply to and where, and how does that stipulate the requirements and controls that we need to push into our supply chain as well. And then from a governance perspective, as I mentioned earlier on, our customers care that you get this right, certainly depending on the products and services that you offer. If you're in financial services, if you're in telecoms, if you're in pharma, for example, you've got some pretty sensitive data on your customers, and they're trusting you to do the right thing to effectively protect that. And, and I think that's why the executive team are really buying into this now, because they recognize that the tolerance from a customer perspective to breaches is certainly going down. And there's an expectation that the right steps and measures are taken to adequately protect the security and the data that is ultimately the target of any attack. So that's why they really should care. And, obviously explaining to them if they're not caring isn't a bad thing. And then there's quality, and this is often overlooked, but quality is absolutely critical, right? We had this challenge over here in Europe, not just in the UK and Europe, where the quality over the supply chain in meat wasn't really there. And we actually found out that in some cases, horse meat was making it into ready-made lasagnas and ready-made, processed meat products, for example. And the customer didn't know that. It wasn't on the label. It was a whole supply chain breakdown. So again, just to highlight that we're not just focusing on cyber IT risk here. We've got quality in, we've got our compliance requirements. We have to satisfy our regulators. We need to understand what are the risks in terms of supply. Can we actually get hold of that product and services, and what are we going to be doing? So it's a whole picture. And if you think about all of that as an entirety, that's why the executive team are starting to care, because if this goes wrong, or if it starts to erode, or the quality goes, then obviously that impacts the product and service that you deliver to your consumer. And they're going to want to know about it, and they're going to start to come to whoever manages third-party risk management within your organization. And because of this holisticness, it's not always the CISO. This isn't always a security-led initiative in all organizations, but you'll always play a role in that. And it's important just to recognize that. So how do different companies approach the challenge? And, I see this breadth on a daily basis. And, I'm certainly not going to go through each one of these individually, but, there are companies that, quite frankly, do very little, the bare minimum. The business can dictate who they want to, put contractual arrangements in place. There's very little due diligence performed. Therefore, they don't understand the risk. They don't understand if the person behind the business is a sanctioned individual in some countries. So I don't think really doing nothing is acceptable anymore. You have to, have some moral compass, and you have to understand, where is your data flowing on your customers. And certainly, as I said, if you're working for a regulated industry, it's a requirement that you actually have to have an effective third-party program operating. So others do more, they're a little bit more managed, they have some engagement, but they don't extend their control environment into their supply chain. They don't stipulate, this is how we expect you to behave. Here's our security policy. Here's what we expect you to do. And hey, here's the framework that we're going to operate within. And then as you start to move up, you start to get into the more mature space where the third-party risk management program is established. You can't engage with a supplier without going through the pre-engagement due diligence. And all of the risks are kind of understood before that contract is put in place and before money starts to flow or services start to flow between the two organizations. And I think at a minimum, that's where you can expect to be, or certainly the expectation is that you start to get there because you actually start to understand the risks and the issues that are contained within that commercial arrangement that you've just still put in place. But there's still more to do. So at a minimum 3, but you certainly should be striving for 4 and 5. So what we want is we want to understand all of the risks that a supplier presents to us before that contract is signed. We've extended some controls to them, or actually the more mature aspect is that we've extended all of our controls that we think are relevant to that particular supplier. So we understand that supplier, we understand what they're doing for us on a global basis, we understand the nature of how they operate, we understand what security policies and practices they deploy, we understand the capabilities within their teams, we understand the geographies that they're going to be operating within, and we have these frequent sit-downs with them depending on the criticality of them to us to get that continual assurance. And that's the start of a partnership, it's the start of a relationship. And obviously you can't do that with every supplier, but the aim is to start to get as much information as you can. And as you'll see shortly, I'm a great advocate, and hence why I'm talking for tools like Prevalent, because if you're moving away from an Excel or a manual-based approach to an online threat-driven, risk-modeled organization like Prevalent, then you can start to get a lot more detailed information on your supplier footprint rather than relying on that manual process that some of you might be running at the moment. So what are some of the problems they encounter? And I think I've encountered most of these in terms of delivering an effective third-party risk management program. And these are some of the barriers that stop that effective executive relationship being put in place. There's nothing worse than you trying to run an effective program, but the broader business think it's a bottleneck, think it's a challenge, think it's not effective. So you really have to work in collaboration with your broader stakeholders and actually understand, what are these issues and challenges and how can you move forward from it. But I see these all the time. I see, security teams running manual processes based on Excel. You might have a 50-person security team. You might have 2 people dedicated to third-party risk management. They might have 3,500 suppliers to manage. It just can't be done. It's like trying to run a security operations center with manual processes. It's like trying to run a data loss prevention platform with manual processes. The numbers are just too great. And thankfully, the world has moved on, and we have to embrace the technology that's been developed to help us number crunch and get an accurate position. So I see security teams taking the brunt of it. I've done a webinar for Prevalent as well on how to improve the relationship between the security team and procurement, and you should look at that because the objectives are very similar in terms of what are people trying to achieve. But if the security team's process isn't optimized, if we're sending out very long questionnaires, if we're sending them out once a year and then we're not getting back to the supplier with feedback, then procurement get the brunt of that. They get the complaints from the suppliers saying, we're ready to deliver our service or product to you, but we can't do it yet because we haven't got sign off from your security team. And then that starts to create friction between the procurement team and the security team. So it's really understanding what are the processes, how can they be optimized, who are the stakeholders that are going to be involved in this. And then we go up to the executive, the board or the executive layer, the CEO, CFO, COO, etc. And they can't get clarity. And I'll highlight some of this later on in the deck, but what they're looking for is what I've coined as meaningful metrics. They want, the analysis to be done for them. They want to understand what are the major risks within our supply chain, where are they likely to materialize, and what are we doing to mitigate it? It's a fairly simplistic question, but when you broaden that across an entire supply chain, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 suppliers in some cases, it's quite a hard question to answer. So we need to embrace, obviously, the technology that's there to help us get that answer as quickly as possible. So what are, that executive team looking for? They're looking for 100% coverage, and this is really, really important. In any process that we deliver or deploy needs to cover all third parties globally. And I see this as a bit of a challenge or a blocker for these stretched security teams. Sometimes it's still 3 or 4 people to cover a multinational organization. And that can be an issue because suppliers, quite frankly, and honestly, from my perspective, like to slice and dice companies in some way. If they can do, they'll sell to the UK business, then they'll sell to the Indian business, and they'll sell to the Turkish and the US and the Canadian, etc. And they actually like organizations that haven't got that global view because they can set different pricing, they can set different contractual terms, and they can leverage that uncertainty. What we need to do is work effectively with our procurement colleagues to make sure that we've got clarity over where is our spend going so we can get maximum bang for our buck. But equally, we can actually manage that risk exposure more effectively. It's a lot better to give a lot of the spending to a few suppliers as possible, because then you become more important to them. You can get that relationship put in place, and actually you can start to understand that risk. If you've got 10, 20, 30 suppliers across the globe overlapping in terms of the services they offer to you, then that's going to be a challenge to manage from a risk perspective, but equally it doesn't make financial sense to do it that way. But equally, you need to understand, if you've got these third-party assurance teams sitting somewhere like the US or the UK, and they might understand the local business that we have with the supplier, but they might not understand that in another country like India, this supplier is huge. So we need to understand that global coverage from our supplier footprint and what that actually looks to us from a risk perspective. And then we need to actually obviously balance that risk. We can't spend all of the time that we need to actually focus with each of our suppliers. We need to tier them. We need that ability to drill down. We need the data to be able to be modeled. We need to understand and inject that threat angle. And that's what's really critical with platforms like Prevalent. And certainly when I started in security, I would have loved this tool to be around. But, we did have to use Excel. It was all we had at the time. And you can't introduce risk. As soon as the company is assessed, we can't introduce threat. And as soon as the organization is assessed, the data is out of date pretty much straight away. We all know the change that happens in each of our organizations, and therefore our suppliers are no different. The risk position will look different day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. So we need a capability to keep our finger on the pulse from a supplier perspective and actually understand what is going on from a risk perspective. We need that ability to drill down into that data. And we need to be able to operate in facts, not fiction. If you go into an executive team with perspectives and views rather than fact, then that will very quickly not hold water. So we need to be able to make sure that we've done the analysis for them up front. We need to make sure that it's fully quantified, that we've got faith in what they're presenting, and that we can model going forward what we think that risk position is going to look like. For example, we may use the Suez Canal blockage, for example. We may have used a supplier that traversed that route, but actually we should have thought through that might have materialized as an issue, and we've got a backup plan that we can invoke and put in place. And then we need the meaningful metrics that we've just discussed. We need to get the board and the executive team bought in. You cannot go in, and I'll show an example in a little while, you cannot go in with highly complex grids and expect them to do the analysis and the modeling of what the risk position is on the fly. We need to actually do all of that for them. They can't do that in the meeting. It's too much information, and they certainly can't present, these complex grids with rags all over the place. So we have to put the legwork in. We have to understand what are the KPIs and the KRIs that we want to present, and actually we want them to be able to actually, lend their backing or their support, or we can make meaningful decisions to move forward. But if we compare that to the CISO's priorities, what is the CISO there to do? I mean, fundamentally, when I was the CISO of large organizations, I was viewed as, you're protecting the brand. There's huge investment that goes into promoting a positive brand position for your organization in the eyes of your current customers and your potential customers going forward. And nothing impacts that worse than a security incident. And that can be a supplier of yours as well. So you are giving, or in all likelihood, the people on this call are giving data to other suppliers to process on your behalf. You still remain the data owner, but there are people controlling that data on your behalf. And if they have a breach of the data, then actually it's still your problem, it's still your challenge. And getting that understanding and recognizing that you have to protect your data in someone else's network, and that's where your control frameworks and all of those aspects come in. And that's what the executive team want to understand. They are getting comfortable with working with a distributed supply chain. They're getting comfortable working with aspects like cloud computing, but it all comes down to how we managing the risk. What are we doing to embed our control environments into these new ways of working? And it's the CISO's job in most organizations. Maybe in financial services, you have the CRO, Chief Risk Officer, for example, but you have to manage that risk exposure. And it is very, very challenging. In my view, in my personal view, the third-party risk is one of the most dynamic and challenging risks to quantify, to present, and also to manage, because you're dealing with so many different organizations, and something can happen at any one of those organizations that can spoil your day and obviously cause a significant challenge to your organization. So it's getting your head around, who are my critical suppliers? Who do I need to spend the time with? Who's processing data on our behalf? Who has access to our network? All of those questions need answering in advance so that you can actually, quantify that risk and manage that effectively within the organization. And as we discussed, it's the CISO's job to adhere to compliance and regulation. And this is only going to go in one way. But I think, we can't get overburdened with compliance. It's something that we actually have to do, of course. But I don't believe that compliance equals security. I've done lots of work for lots of organizations that have been 100% compliant to their security, 100% compliant to their regulatory requirements, but have still suffered fairly significant security incidents. So we can't just rest on our laurels and actually say, well, we comply to this, we comply to that. So, we have to have that risk and threat driven view of the world and actually understand that there are ways around our security and there are ways around our processes, that even if we are compliant to our security policies. So, it's getting that hacker mindset and actually understanding how can we test ourselves, how can we test our suppliers to make sure we've got maximum levels of security. Because ultimately, we're trying to protect our customers' data. I think that is, one of the key CISO priorities. We are the custodian of that trust that has been put in from our customer perspective, and it's the right thing to do. And lots of the discussions I've had, where things haven't been going the security way is, pretend the customer's in the room, pretend one of our customers is sitting in that chair over there. Would they be comfortable and confident with the way that we're going? Would they be comfortable and confident with the way we're managing risk? And that's the litmus test that I always use to understand, are we doing the right thing going forward? So what options do we actually have to improve, right? So we can improve. We can invest in tooling. And, that is absolutely the key thing, and hopefully why a lot of you are actually sitting on this call today is saying, well, what can we do? What can we improve to go forward? The world has moved on from the world of Excel. So if you're sitting there today thinking, well, we send out manual questionnaires and we have analysts actually look at the findings. And, if analyst A looks at something versus analyst B, we might end up at a different perspective on a supplier. Or if you're sitting there thinking, we use one process, but procurement use another. So actually we have two different views of risk from a supplier within our organization. We have to start to harmonize that view down. So investing in tooling, recognizing that there's great products and capability out there that can help you get that rapid view of a supplier going forward. And I was a customer of Prevalent when I was a CISO, and the thing I actually loved about it, just a small story from my perspective, running a large global organization, lots of new suppliers coming on a daily basis. And, this is the days when we were running Excel and we were running manual processes. And the business used to come to us and say, look, Bryan, we want to start a business relationship with this supplier. we knew nothing about them from the outset. So we only knew what we could Google. And that was the challenge. And then we had to send them out our questionnaire. And then we had the lag of them filling in the questionnaire. And then we had to get the results back and we had to analyze it. And that, frankly, could take weeks. Now you can log on to a platform and obviously thousands of suppliers are pre-coded into this platform. So you're already starting off from a big leap forward where you've got, a lot of information that other customers have asked this supplier. And actually what I think you'll find out is there's a very small amount of additional questions that you'll need to satisfy your own security policies or risk requirements. And then you've got a good holistic view of that supplier. And that really shortcuts that process to getting that risk-driven approach nailed down. But that is absolutely critical that you do get there. And equally, what I like about it is it brings in that threat angle. As I said, that threat position from a supplier can change day on day. And you don't want to be, finding out that there's issues from your supplier from Sky News or CNN or your local news channel. You want to be a little bit more, have your finger on the pulse from that perspective. So the community aspect and, that collective view of everyone that's using this supplier, or equally that supplier communicating out that they've had a challenge, and the notifications you can get, that really gives you that near real-time view of what it actually is the risk within my supply chain on a day-to-day basis. Because if you think about it from that Excel way of working, you wouldn't actually find out anything materially new unless you sent them out another questionnaire and it was analyzed. So I think we have to leave that world behind and as it says, leave Excel behind as well. But that segmentation needs to be done carefully. And, I've worked with lots of procurement organizations and lots of business stakeholders. And, quite frankly and honestly, lots of business people don't want their supplier to be in tier one because they understand that that's extra governance, it's extra headache, it's extra paperwork. But it's us that working with the business that have to actually decide, what makes a tier one supplier, what makes a tier two, and what makes a tier three. And that's frankly, it's going to be different for every different organization that's listening on this call. There's no unique, rule set that actually categorizes within them, but there are some, standard requirements, customer data, logical, physical access to our environments and all of those aspects. So, getting that tiering right and understanding, how can we use our scarce resources as effectively as possible to spend, quality time on moving those relationships from, a supplier up into a partnership where they clearly understand what we expect of them and we understand, their ways of working. I think that has to be the objective and the goal. So let's talk a little bit about, meaningful metrics. And, this is actually an example, an obfuscated example, of course, of what some of the things that I've seen in my consulting world. And this is only one page of it, right? This grid went on and on and on. And this was actually in an executive board pack. And some of you might recognize something like this, but if you are using this way and model, it doesn't work. This was brought into an executive meeting and it was left down to the non-executive directors and the executive team to scroll along suppliers and see a red and then scroll up to a control. And then to try and gauge, well, who is that supplier? What do they do for us? And how critical is this control? And obviously there's a few reds on controls and there's a couple of reds on suppliers. You can't live in that world. It's too complex and you're not going to get an accurate view of the risk that relates to you. It's too busy. You're looking at it, you can't see the wood for the trees almost. But the worst thing is it's static. That picture won't change materially month on month. And it will take a huge amount of effort to update that data sets, right? So getting in touch with each supplier and having a physical conversation or email conversation with them, understanding where is their progress on control X, Y, Z, and what does their time frame and plan look like? And then understanding, well, is that a red? Is that an amber? Is that a green? And that's where you can burn, the resource on a team. And that's where you see security leaders or risk leaders going into the board saying, we need another 10, 20 people. But actually you don't, you just haven't optimized your process. You haven't optimized your tooling. You can actually handle, a fairly complex supply chain with modern tooling with a fairly lean team. if you're actually embracing, the new ways of working and the new capabilities. And actually, when I moved from Excel-based approaches into, tools like Prevalent when I was a CISO, it was actually taking dashboards into the actual meeting room and showing, this is the movement that we've had. Here's where we think, the major risks are presenting themselves in our supply chain. And you can start to have those meaningful conversations. You can drill down. You can click on individual suppliers that are of notable concern or that we think we're having regulatory issues for, and you can actually discuss what those mitigations that are currently in flight and what the impact is going to be. So obviously you can see, moving from a very complex static way of presenting information into a highly dynamic, I think that really helps, foster that engagement with the executive team. And I think it's really important to understand, what are the executive team there for? Obviously, the CEO, CFO, COO, etc., the C-suite, they're there to run the company. Then when you step above that and you're actually interacting with the board, typically, depending on the organization size, they're representing the shareholders' interests. And in a lot of sectors, the non-executive directors have, personal liability and accountability on their own financial situation to make sure that things are done appropriately and that things are done correctly. And then obviously they're representing the interests of the shareholders as well. So that's why they give challenge. That's why they ask for improvement. That's why they ask for things to move forward. And are we doing things the right way? And how are other companies approaching it? And have we asked and made sure that we're approaching things the right way? Because we have to mature. We have to be able to, keep that capability improving going forward. And that's where, some of those sometimes difficult conversations around budget and resource, I would personally focus on making sure that I've fully optimized my way of working, that I've embraced the latest technology, and then obviously go up and present a very clear picture. And I think that will show that you've taken it very seriously and that you can get that buy-in and support into what you're trying to achieve going forward. So what are some of the metrics and best practices that you should be measuring? Let me just build this up. So I think that, broad categories from a board and executive team perspective fall into these 4 categories that I think, you can distill all of your KPIs, you can distill all of your measures into these 4 different areas: risk, threat, compliance, and coverage. If you can actually, put your communication into the executive and the board into these buckets, you won't be far wrong in terms of getting the engagement and getting them to actually understand what you're trying to achieve. Risk is, as I've mentioned, the universal language of the board. You can't go into a board or an executive team and talk technical. Technical language loses its, traction as soon as it leaves the technical audience. And not a lot of board members and executive teams, in my view, depending on obviously the organization and the nature of that organization, really understand the technicalities of what we're trying to achieve. So if there are technical issues and controls that are failing, we need to translate that into risk. We need to translate that into threat. What are the likelihood of that occurring? And from a threat perspective, I see so many organizations having to treat threats as incidents. And what I mean by that is they don't actually have the information on their supply base. So when there's a threat floating around out there and it's on the news about, something like Blue Yonder or some malware, crypto malware that's flowing around, you can't answer the question of, are our suppliers susceptible to this? And the latest Log4j challenge that we saw floating around recently, lots of organizations could answer that in a heartbeat because, they knew the capability of their suppliers, they knew their patching regime, they knew what technology was in play, they knew their approach to using open source technology. So they could actually answer that very quickly. Others that are on a more manual approach said, well, we've got to go and ask 3,000 suppliers, we've got to send out emails, we've got to wait for the responses. So fundamentally, we don't understand what our threat exposure is. So you can see the benefit of moving into, yes, we need to understand the risk, but actually we need to, model that through our threat intelligence and our threat feeds as well. And compliance, we kind of covered, it's not going to go away. It's a necessary evil. But I think, compliance is becoming more standardized around the globe. And it's a good thing in some regards because it's making, organizations step up their security. certainly over here in the UK, financial services, telecommunications, critical national infrastructure, there's a lot of focus from the governments across Europe to stress test companies from a red teaming or an ethical hacking perspective, and actually moving away from policies and procedures and saying, well, how actually would you perform if you were hacked or attacked? And getting that insights and that learning is a lot more insightful on how to move forward from a risk perspective. And then getting that coverage, I've seen it happen a lot. Where organizations think that they're not impacted by an issue, but they actually are, because they haven't understood their entire footprint from a supplier perspective or a geopolitical risk perspective. So, think about these buckets, think about how you're communicating with your board, and do you actually fit into these broader areas? So this is my last slide before I kind of hand over to Scott, and we want to leave a fairly decent chunk of time to get into some of the questions that we can see flowing in. So what do I think are some of the trends, dynamics, and futures, and how does that kind of impact how we engage with our executive teams and move things forward in a positive footprint? Static information is obsolete, right? Hopefully you've picked up that that's my personal view, but I see it time and time again, and I know there'll be several people on this call thinking, we're using a static process, we're not happy using a static process, but we can't get the buy-in to be able to move forward. And hopefully some of the arguments around you can't model threat, you don't know what others are doing, your data's out of date as soon as you captured it, etc. And, it's an expectation from your customers that you take security seriously. We have to start to move forward and embrace some of the enhancements that have been made in this technology to actually, get that capability. And I see, more and more organizations recognizing that you need that near real-time view. And, those examples that I used around, you wouldn't run a security operations center on manual processes, you wouldn't run a manual data loss prevention platform and all of those aspects. And third-party risk management is no different. It's a number crunching exercise, and you need the tools and platforms to help you crunch those numbers for you and prevent a real-time or near real-time view of what your current risk exposure is. And I think, threat absolutely changes everything. And, I saw it happen with my own eyes. I was on a trade and investment mission in Israel. And as everyone knows, lots of security technology is developed out there. And, it was a global trade and investment mission, and there was CISOs there from all over the globe. And then Blue Yonder hit. And, that was a fairly catastrophic incident for some, but not all. And I saw, a full plethora of responses to that. I saw people running for planes because, their mothership organization was calling them back because things were collapsing, to people just checking a few applications and saying, yes, there's a threat. We don't think it's a risk to us. We know our patch status. We know the patch status of our suppliers. So getting that real-time view can actually, stop significant costs, significant investment, or certainly offset it, because you're not having to treat every threat as an incident and drive things forward from that perspective as well. So I thank you for my time. Thank you for your time. I can see lots of questions coming in. I'm going to hand over to Scott, who's going to talk to you around, a few slides on the prevalent platform, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Scott, over to you.
Hey, that's great. Thanks so much, Brian. And if you could advance to the next slide, please. One of the big takeaways that I took for Brian's presentation is the inherent level of complexity to understand risks as they are presented to the organization in whatever format, at whatever stage of the third-party lifecycle that your vendor suppliers are in, and then presenting that meaningfully back to decision makers, leaders, executives, board members, or whatever. That takes a solution that addresses risks at those different levels. The last thing, we want to end up doing, or that you want to end up doing, is presenting a set, as Brian said, of disparate data that doesn't really tie together or make any sense, or, doesn't have any kind of context to it. And that's how, and what Prevalent specializes in, is the context that you need to understand risk at every one of these stages and present it in a meaningful way back to, senior leadership in the organization, not just to manage, ongoing incidents, but also to show proactivity and discipline and rigor in the process to address potentially, compliance and audit requirements as well. And that approach has some derivative benefits as well, including less cost and risk when you're selecting new vendors, if you've got good visibility into the risk postures that those vendors bring inherently. a faster onboarding process to, as you get more intelligence and insight over a vendor's, security and data protection and business resilience policies, you reduce some downstream risk by getting that picture early on in the cycle. The next piece of it is not just looking at the periodic risk assessments that you do during onboarding and due diligence or during contract renewal, but perhaps, in between those, detailed internal controls assessments, what type of intelligence do you need to make sure you're on top of whatever, persistent threats that, that you're facing in your extended supply chain, and then incorporate that context, collate it, and then, be able to use it to validate the presence of internal controls at those vendor sites, or validate that, they've got the right policies in place. And then it also extends to, a vendor's ability to deliver. It's not just about, a cybersecurity, information security, data privacy, business resilience problem that a vendor or supplier could face. It's also about their ability to just simply deliver on expectations, whether those are KRIs, KPIs, the things that Bryan has presented on very thoroughly in the past. And then finally, the risk stage that most companies just don't pay enough attention to is offboarding and termination. We do tons of due diligence before selecting vendors. We, assess the inherent risks that those folks bring to our organizations. We deliver good reporting. We recommend remediations. We follow them through the life cycle. But then when that relationship ends, very seldom does an organization follow that prescriptive process to say, okay, what are your data destruction policies? Is our data destroyed? A final payment's been made? Have we met all of our reporting obligations and more? All of these types of things are going to come up at some point from a board when an off-boarded vendor, for example, suddenly becomes a risk because they didn't follow the proper protocols to destroy your data, for example. And this has benefits throughout the enterprise, from procurement to security to risk management, compliance, and more. Next slide, please, Bryan. What I think you'll find in the prevalent approach is that we absorb, assess, and analyze risks from literally hundreds and thousands of different sources, not just completed assessments that vendors complete, but also 500,000 sources of outside or external threat intelligence. And we bucketize those into, these 6 buckets that you see in front of you now. And these are just representations. Yeah, there's more than this. It's all I could fit on a slide. But we look at risk holistically, not just the most obvious data privacy and protection risks, but we also look at things like health and safety and ESG ratings and more. So you have a full view of the risks that those vendors, suppliers, and third parties are presenting your business. So when there's a reputational problem for a supplier who's been using, forced labor overseas to produce, an input into your process, you will have that visibility and be able to respond to it accordingly. Next slide, please, Bryan. At the end of the day, our process is really threefold. What we're trying to help you accomplish is that, we help make you smarter with a data-driven, comprehensive, and contextual approach to risk intelligence, give you the inputs that you need to make, good risk-based decisions, unify what normally is a whole disparate set of siloed tools that are used to kind of consume this information, report on it, and unify it into one solution so everybody's singing from the same hymnal, as we say. And finally, be very prescriptive in our approach with built-in intelligence, risk response and plans, remediation guidance, and more to accelerate the process of third-party risk management and reporting to the board and executives, and ultimately kind of close the loop on those potential risks that could impact your environment. And really, that's it. That's our approach. Is how we take information from all these disparate sources, translate it into a meaningful fashion that you can utilize, and then that translates to actionable steps to take to remediate risk down on the other side. So that's our approach. Amanda, I'll pop it back over to you if you want to open it up for questions.
Yep, sure will. I have a poll question myself here that I will throw up on the screen. Are you guys looking to establish a third-party risk management program in 2022? We're curious about that. Please, again, be honest with that answer. And we did have a question in the beginning of the session here that I'll hand it over to Bryan for. And Juliana had asked, do you view third-party risk management and procurement as separate departments with separate channels to the board?
Yeah, well, I do, yes. I mean, obviously, there's some overlap in terms of from a risk perspective, what security and procurement are trying to deliver. But then there's significant other areas that there isn't an overlap in, right? So procurement are there to buy products and services, get effective leverage from a spend perspective. So I think, they need their own communication channel to the board. What I think doesn't work is from a risk perspective, if we're getting two different views of risk from a supplier perspective. And, what I see happen a lot is, organizations, especially the larger organizations, are using, the large ERP platforms across their procurement space. And in that, there are obviously capabilities to, talk around suppliers and, interactions with suppliers. And sometimes they're utilized to, gauge a level of risk and those aspects. What we need to do is harmonize or integrate those platforms together so that we've got a single view of supplier risk across the organization. Because if procurement have a view and then security have a view, and never the twain shall agree, then I don't think that's good from a business perspective, not to have that alignment and agreement. So I think watch the webinar I did on procurement, because it talks around, how the chief procurement officer and the chief security officer, have a lot of, commonality in their objectives and what they're trying to achieve. And I think that will certainly help, crystallize what my thoughts are on how you can converge that communication channel to the board, right?
And if you're interested in that webinar and if you wanted to see it and want quick access, just email me. I have my email in this thread of chat here. So I will happily find that for you. Next question is, can you please discuss briefly on the best practices, how to categorize the criticality of these third-party vendors?
Yeah, so I mean, it all comes down to what they're doing for you and the impact that can have on the parent organization. So I mean, it's probably a poor example, but, every organization needs to procure, kitchen supplies, needs to procure bathroom supplies and all of those aspects. They're going to be a supplier to your organization and a strategic supplier, but they may not necessarily present the level of risk that, someone that's running your data centers will. So it's important to get that categorization correct so that you know where you're going to spend most of your time. But then equally, what I always say on the back end of this example is I've seen organizations breached by their kitchen supplier, right? Because, there's a dedicated connection between the two organizations. So you're certainly not discounting or ignoring organizations in a lower tier. You're still going to require them to, have a certain baseline level of security, but it's recognizing that you can't get around all of your vendors from a security perspective, or certainly you couldn't. And that's why, again, evangelizing tools like what we're talking about today, because once you've categorized them, you can start to get that threat feed, that information, how seriously do they take security? Are they likely to present as a risk? So I think, to categorize them, really, really important, have access to our network, have access to our customer data, model our customer data on our behalf, interact with our customers on our behalf. They're critically important, and then move down from there.
Definitely. And we have something just like that here too, if that's what you're initially just looking to do. And we can definitely talk about that. If you want to look to figure out having to profile and tier your vendors, reach out to us. That would be great. Next question is a question for Bryan. Risk assessors typically rely on SOC reports to evaluate the vendor controls. Is this a good approach, such as critical? Oh, no, that was two different questions. Sorry. That was a part two of the other one. Let me repeat this one again. A question for Bryan. Okay. Risk assessors typically rely on SOC reports to evaluate the vendor's controls. Is this a good approach?
I think it's a reasonable approach. And, I sympathize with the Googles, the AWSs, the HPs of this world, right? Because if you think about it, they've got tens of thousands of customers. Each one of those customers wants to assess their security, their approach, and how they handle things. Everyone wants the right to audit all of these aspects, and they just can't possibly do that because they have, you know, customers that share environments. If they haven't paid for dedicated environments, there's data centers with other companies' data's involved, etc. So they can't open their doors to everyone to come and have a roam around and, you know, see how cables are plugged in, etc. So I think that's where SOC reports and SOC 2 reports, etc., come into their own, because it gives you that base level understanding of, you know, how do they approach security and how seriously do they take it? What are some of the challenges and issues that they had? But I certainly wouldn't rely purely on SOC reports, you know, and I think that's where, again, you know, prevalent in those aspects, you can get that open source information, that OSINT capability to actually understand, well, they say they do this in their SOC report, but they've had a public facing vulnerability for 30 days and their policy says they should have fixed it in 24 hours. So, you know, you can hold people to account from their SOC reports by using platforms such as this, because, you know, what people say versus what they do are sometimes different. And that's where I personally utilize those capabilities. But, you know, that's my example of, you know, if a large organization has to service lots of customers, that's where, you know, SOC requirements are, you know, needed and required, right?
Something else we help with. Just shameless plug. Shameless plug here.
Yeah, I'm teeing you up here, right? So.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like that might be all the questions that we have for the both of you. Anyone else have anything that they are looking for as far as resources, wanting the slides? I know a lot of you have been asking for those, or wanting to see other things that we had done with Bryan and we featured Bryan on. Please reach out to me. I'm trying to catch up here, but I'm going to put my email in one more time. For anyone that wants to chat about anything we covered, please feel free to reach out so you have someone directly to talk to. And I think that will be it. I think we'll just close 5 minutes early, give you guys back some time on your day. And I really appreciate both of you. Always great to see you, Bryan. Always great to see you, Scott.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.